The Hundred Years' War began in 1337 as a culmination of deep-seated rivalries between England and France over territorial disputes and a contested claim to the French throne. The origins of the conflict can be traced back to the late 12th century, when King Henry II of England married Eleanor of Aquitaine, bringing vast French territories under English control. These lands, including Aquitaine, Normandy, and others, became a source of tension as French kings sought to consolidate their kingdom and reduce English influence on their soil. By the early 14th century, this simmering tension had evolved into open hostility, exacerbated by dynastic ambitions, economic rivalries, and political intrigues. The immediate spark of the Hundred Years' War came in 1328 with the death of Charles IV of France. Charles died without a male heir, leaving the French throne vacant. The closest male relative was Edward III of England, whose mother, Isabella, was the sister of Charles IV. Edward's claim was legitimate by bloodline, but French nobles balked at the idea of a foreign ruler. Instead, they invoked Salic law, an ancient Frankish code that barred inheritance through the female line, and crowned Philip VI, a cousin of Charles IV, as king. This decision not only denied Edward's claim, but also set the stage for a protracted struggle between the two kingdoms. Tensions boiled over in 1337 when Philip VI confiscated the Duchy of Aquitaine, a territory under English control but nominally a fief of the French crown. Edward III responded by formally claiming the French throne, transforming what might have been a localized dispute into a full-scale war. The opening stages of the conflict were marked by English raids along the French coast, known as chevauchées, which aimed to disrupt French trade, weaken morale, and drain resources. The first major confrontation came in 1346 at the Battle of Crécy, a turning point in medieval warfare. Edward III's army, composed of heavily armored knights, infantry, and a contingent of longbowmen, faced a significantly larger French force led by Philip VI. The English longbow, a weapon of remarkable range and power, proved devastating against the French knights. The archers unleashed volleys of arrows that cut down waves of attackers, rendering the French cavalry's traditional charges ineffective. The battlefield was littered with the dead, a stark reminder of the longbow's transformative impact on medieval combat. Crécy was not just a military victory, it was a psychological one as well. It demonstrated the effectiveness of disciplined troops and innovative tactics over sheer numbers. The battle also highlighted the vulnerabilities of the French feudal system, where regional lords often acted independently, undermining cohesive military strategy. For Edward III, it was a triumph that solidified his position as a formidable leader and emboldened his claim to the French crown. In the aftermath of Crécy, Edward capitalized on his momentum by laying siege to the port city of Calais, a strategic gateway to continental Europe. The siege lasted nearly a year, from 1346 to 1347, and ended with the city's surrender. Calais became a vital English stronghold, serving as a base for future campaigns and a symbol of English resilience. Its capture also disrupted French trade routes, further weakening Philip VI's position. The English successes, however, were not without their challenges. The outbreak of the Black Death in 1347 ravaged Europe, decimating populations on both sides of the conflict. The plague disrupted military campaigns and strained economies, forcing a temporary lull in hostilities. Despite this, the war resumed in the 1350s with renewed vigor, as Edward III sought to consolidate his gains and press his advantage. Edward's son, Edward the Black Prince, emerged as a key figure during this phase of the war. Renowned for his courage and leadership, the Black Prince led the English forces to another significant victory at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. Once again, the longbow played a crucial role, and the French suffered a humiliating defeat. King John II of France was captured, a blow that plunged France into political chaos and further destabilized its monarchy. The capture of the French king gave England a powerful bargaining chip, but it also revealed the limits of military victories in achieving lasting dominance. Despite their successes, the English struggled to administer and hold the vast territories they had captured. The costs of war mounted, and internal dissent grew as resources were stretched thin. In 1360, the Treaty of Bretigny temporarily halted the conflict. The treaty granted Edward III significant territorial concessions, including full sovereignty over Aquitaine, in exchange for renouncing his claim to the French throne. While this appeared to be a victory for England, it was far from a resolution. The treaty's terms were fragile, and neither side was fully satisfied, ensuring that the underlying tensions remained unresolved. The first phase of the Hundred Years' War was a period of dramatic shifts in fortune, marked by innovative tactics, devastating battles, and profound political ramifications. It set the tone for a century-long struggle that would reshape the political and social landscapes of both England and France. Though England achieved remarkable victories during this period, the war was far from over, and the tides would soon begin to turn against Edward III and his successors. As the uneasy truce forged by the Treaty of Bretigny began to unravel, hostilities between England and France reignited in 1369, plunging the two kingdoms back into a conflict that would take on new dimensions. France, under the leadership of Charles V, sought to reclaim the territories ceded to England, while Edward III of England aimed to protect his holdings and uphold the terms of the treaty. However, the landscape of the war was changing, with both nations grappling with internal challenges and adopting new strategies that would shape the conflict's outcome. Charles V, often referred to as Charles the Wise, was a calculating and methodical ruler. Unlike his predecessors, who relied heavily on chivalric ideals and large-scale battles, Charles pursued a strategy of attrition and avoidance of open conflict. Recognizing the devastation wrought by England's devastating chevauchés, he aimed to turn the tide through patience and precision. He appointed Bertrand du Guesclin, a brilliant tactician and one of France's most celebrated military leaders, as Constable of France. Du Guesclin's unconventional approach focused on guerrilla warfare, fortification, and the strategic recapture of key territories, gradually eroding English control. Du Guesclin's campaigns targeted English strongholds with a mix of siege warfare and skirmishes, avoiding the catastrophic losses that often came with pitched battles. His successes revitalized the French war effort, demonstrating that discipline and persistence could overcome the English reliance on shock tactics and superior weaponry. Cities such as Poitiers and Limoges were reclaimed, and the French began to restore their fractured kingdom piece by piece. On the English side, the death of Edward III's heir, the Black Prince, in 1376 dealt a significant blow to their morale and leadership. Edward III himself was aging and increasingly ineffective, leaving the English war effort hampered by a lack of cohesive strategy. By the time of Edward's death in 1377, the English throne passed to his grandson, Richard II, a child of 10. The regency and subsequent rule of Richard II were marked by political instability, peasant revolts, and internal dissent, all of which distracted from the war in France. England's fragile economy, already strained by the war's enormous costs and the lingering effects of the Black Death, further undermined its ability to sustain its campaigns. During this period, the conflict shifted from grand battles to smaller, localized engagements, as France's strategy of regaining control through diplomacy and skirmishes began to yield results. The English found themselves on the defensive, struggling to maintain their footholds in French territories. France's recovery was bolstered by Charles V's administrative reforms, which strengthened the monarchy's authority, improved taxation, and rebuilt the war-torn economy. These efforts not only funded the military campaigns, but also fostered a sense of unity among the French people, who had previously been divided by feudal rivalries and regional loyalties. By the 1380s, France had regained much of the territory it had lost in the earlier phases of the war, and the English were increasingly confined to a few isolated strongholds. The death of Charles V in 1380, however, temporarily disrupted France's momentum. His son and successor, Charles VI, ascended the throne as a child, leading to a period of regency and internal turmoil. Meanwhile, Richard II's rule in England continued to be plagued by domestic unrest, culminating in his deposition in 1399 by Henry IV, the first king of the Lancastrian dynasty. Despite these internal struggles, the war continued, albeit at a slower pace. By the turn of the 15th century, both kingdoms were exhausted, and the conflict seemed to be settling into a prolonged stalemate. However, a new phase of the war began with the accession of Henry V to the English throne in 1413. Young, ambitious, and determined to revive England's fortunes, Henry V launched an audacious campaign to reclaim lost territories and assert his claim to the French crown. Henry V's campaign marked a dramatic resurgence for the English. In 1415, he led an invasion force across the Channel, targeting Normandy. His meticulous planning and charismatic leadership quickly earned him the loyalty of his troops and the admiration of his court. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Agincourt, a victory that would become one of the most celebrated in English history. At Agincourt, Henry's army, though vastly outnumbered, delivered a stunning defeat to the French forces. Once again, the English longbow proved decisive, cutting down waves of French knights as they charged through muddy terrain under relentless volleys of arrows. The battle was a catastrophe for France, with thousands of knights and nobles killed or captured, leaving the French leadership in disarray. Agincourt reaffirmed England's military prowess and reinvigorated their claim to the French throne. However, Henry V's successes masked the enduring challenges faced by England. The victory at Agincourt, while spectacular, did not translate into immediate political or territorial gains. France remained resilient, and the divisions within its leadership began to heal as a shared sense of purpose emerged in the face of English aggression. Moreover, the logistical and financial strains of Henry's campaigns placed a heavy burden on England, highlighting the difficulty of sustaining long-term dominance in France. The period from 1369 to 1415 was one of shifting fortunes, marked by France's recovery under Charles V, England's internal struggles, and Henry V's dramatic resurgence. While the English achieved remarkable victories during this time, their inability to maintain consistent pressure on France and their reliance on short-term military triumphs foreshadowed the eventual decline of their position in the war. For France, the period demonstrated the power of strategic reform and the resilience of a kingdom determined to reclaim its sovereignty. As the conflict entered its final phases, the stage was set for a dramatic conclusion that would redefine the balance of power in Europe. The war between England and France took a dramatic turn in 1429 with the arrival of Joan of Arc, a young peasant girl whose extraordinary journey would alter the course of history. By this time, France was reeling from decades of conflict, its territories divided between English occupation and Burgundian alliances. King Charles VII, the Dauphin of France, was struggling to assert his legitimacy, and morale among his followers was at an all-time low. The tide seemed firmly in favor of England, whose victories at Agincourt and elsewhere had solidified their dominance. Yet, in the most unlikely of circumstances, Joan emerged as a beacon of hope, challenging the status quo with an unwavering belief in her divine mission. Joan of Arc claimed to have been guided by visions from saints instructing her to support Charles VII and drive the English out of France. Her story quickly captured the imagination of both commoners and nobles, offering a rallying point for a fractured and dispirited kingdom. Skeptical at first, Charles VII eventually granted her an audience. Joan's conviction and charisma impressed the king and his court, leading to her inclusion in military operations despite her lack of formal training or noble lineage. In 1429, Joan's leadership came to the forefront during the Siege of Orléans, a critical battle that had become a symbol of French resistance. The city was on the verge of falling to English forces, and its loss would have dealt a devastating blow to French aspirations. Joan, armed with nothing but her faith and determination, inspired the French troops to launch a counteroffensive. Her presence on the battlefield, clad in armor and bearing a standard, emboldened the soldiers and invigorated their resolve. Against the odds, the French broke the siege, securing a decisive victory that marked a turning point in the war. The triumph at Orléans catapulted Joan into the national spotlight and cemented her reputation as a divinely guided savior. It also provided Charles VII with the momentum needed to pursue his coronation. For years, his legitimacy had been questioned due to his failure to undergo the traditional anointment at Reims Cathedral, the sacred site where French kings were crowned. With Joan leading the way, the French forces advanced through English-held territories, paving the path to Reims. In July 1429, Charles VII was crowned in a ceremony that Joan attended, standing prominently at his side. This moment, steeped in symbolism and national pride, reaffirmed Charles's claim to the throne and revitalized the French cause. Despite these successes, Joan's journey was fraught with challenges and contradictions. Her rise to prominence unsettled many within the French court, where jealousy and suspicion began to fester. Additionally, the English viewed her not as a pious visionary, but as a dangerous heretic and a threat to their ambitions. As the war dragged on, Joan's position became increasingly precarious, her victories tempered by the realities of political and military setbacks. In 1430, Joan was captured during a skirmish at Compiègne by Burgundian forces allied with the English. Her capture marked a devastating blow to French morale and provided the English with an opportunity to discredit her influence. Joan was handed over to the English and put on trial for heresy in Rouen, a process steeped in bias and political motivations. The trial was as much about undermining the legitimacy of Charles VII as it was about punishing Joan herself. Despite her impassioned defense and unwavering belief in her divine mission, she was found guilty and sentenced to death. In May 1431, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake, her life cut short at just 19 years old. Her execution was a spectacle meant to extinguish her influence and serve as a warning to those who might oppose English rule. Yet, rather than silence her legacy, Joan's martyrdom solidified her status as a symbol of French resistance and resilience. For the French people, she became a rallying cry, a figure whose sacrifice demanded justice and vindication. Her death, far from ending her impact, marked the beginning of her enduring legacy. The loss of Joan did not deter the French from continuing the fight. If anything, her memory galvanized their resolve. Charles VII, now fully established as king, began to implement reforms to strengthen his authority and unify his kingdom. The tide of the war gradually shifted as France reclaimed its territories, and the English found themselves increasingly overstretched and isolated. Joan's influence lived on through the soldiers who had fought alongside her and the people who revered her as a saint long before her official canonization centuries later. Joan of Arc's role in the Hundred Years' War was transformative, reshaping not only the conflict but also the national identity of France. Her faith, courage, and determination inspired a beleaguered nation to rise against overwhelming odds, demonstrating the power of belief and unity in the face of adversity. While she did not live to see the conclusion of the war, her contributions were instrumental in turning the tide in favor of the French. The legacy of Joan of Arc endured, serving as a reminder of the profound impact one individual can have on the course of history. As the war entered its final phase, the French continued to build on the foundations Joan had helped lay. Charles VII's reign saw the gradual restoration of French sovereignty, culminating in the expulsion of English forces and the emergence of a united and strengthened kingdom. Joan's story remained central to this resurgence, her spirit woven into the fabric of France's national identity. From her humble beginnings to her martyrdom, Joan of Arc's journey exemplified the enduring struggle for freedom and self-determination, a legacy that would resonate far beyond the battlefield. The final phase of the Hundred Years' War, spanning from 1435 to 1453, was marked by a dramatic shift in fortunes as the French steadily reclaimed their sovereignty, ultimately expelling the English from nearly all their continental holdings. The Treaty of Arras in 1435 was a turning point, signaling the reconciliation between the French crown and the powerful Duchy of Burgundy, whose alliance with England had been a cornerstone of English strategy. This agreement not only weakened England's position in France, but also strengthened the French monarchy, giving Charles VII the support he needed to mount a decisive counteroffensive. The Treaty of Arras was more than just a diplomatic triumph. It symbolized the growing unity of France under Charles VII. The Burgundians' defection from the English alliance isolated England and disrupted their ability to coordinate with one of the most influential factions in France. With Burgundy now aligned with the crown, Charles VII could focus on consolidating his authority and reclaiming lost territories without the constant threat of internal division. The treaty marked the beginning of the end for English ambitions in France, as it dismantled the fragile coalition that had sustained their dominance. Charles VII, often referred to as the Restorer of France, capitalized on this newfound unity to implement a series of reforms that would redefine the French state. Recognizing the need for a more centralized and professional military, he established a standing army, funded by permanent taxation. This innovation was revolutionary, breaking from the traditional reliance on feudal levies and mercenaries. The new army was better equipped, disciplined, and loyal to the crown, providing a critical advantage over the English forces, which were increasingly stretched thin and plagued by funding shortages. With his reformed military, Charles VII launched a systematic campaign to reclaim English-occupied territories. The French strategy during this period was characterized by careful planning and relentless pressure. Instead of relying on large, decisive battles, Charles's forces engaged in sieges and smaller engagements, steadily eroding English control. Cities and fortresses that had been under English rule for decades were retaken one by one, including key strongholds like Rouen, which fell in 1449, effectively ending English dominance in Normandy. The English, meanwhile, were grappling with internal strife and a faltering war effort. The political landscape in England was increasingly unstable, with factions vying for power and the crown's authority undermined by mounting debts and military failures. Henry VI, the English king, was a weak and indecisive ruler, unable to provide the leadership necessary to sustain the war. His mental instability further exacerbated the crisis, leaving the English government in disarray and its military campaigns poorly coordinated. The culmination of France's resurgence came in 1453 with the Battle of Castillon, often regarded as the final engagement of the Hundred Years' War. The French forces, commanded by Jean Bureau, demonstrated the effectiveness of Charles VII's reforms, particularly the use of artillery. At Castillon, the French employed heavy cannons with devastating precision, overwhelming the English army led by John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury. The battle was a decisive French victory, marking the collapse of English resistance in Aquitaine and the end of their presence in mainland France, save for the port of Calais. The significance of Castillon went beyond the battlefield. It symbolized the transformation of warfare itself, with artillery and disciplined standing armies emerging as the dominant forces in military strategy. The era of heavily armored knights and chivalric combat was drawing to a close, replaced by the calculated and methodical approaches pioneered during the latter stages of the war. This evolution in military tactics reflected broader societal and political changes, as centralized states like France began to assert greater control over their resources and territories. For England, the loss of the war was a profound blow, marking the end of their continental ambitions and the beginning of a period of introspection and turmoil. The defeat in France coincided with the onset of the Wars of the Roses, a series of civil conflicts that would consume England for decades. These wars further diminished England's ability to project power abroad, effectively ending their role as a major player in European continental politics during the late medieval period. France, by contrast, emerged from the war as a unified and revitalized kingdom. Charles VII's reign saw the restoration of royal authority and the laying of foundations for the centralized state that would define France in the centuries to come. The conclusion of the Hundred Years' War allowed France to focus on internal development, strengthening its economy and consolidating its territorial integrity. The scars of the war, however, were deep, with much of the country left devastated by decades of conflict. Rebuilding would take time, but the sense of national identity forged during the war would prove enduring. The end of the Hundred Years' War also marked a turning point in European history, signaling the decline of feudalism and the rise of the modern state. The conflict had demonstrated the limitations of the feudal system and underscored the importance of centralized authority and professional military forces. It also reflected broader cultural and technological shifts, as innovations in weaponry and tactics reshaped the nature of warfare. The war's legacy extended far beyond its immediate political and territorial outcomes. It left an indelible mark on the identities of both England and France, shaping their trajectories for centuries to come. For England, the loss fostered a sense of insularity and a focus on internal stability, while for France, the victory instilled a renewed sense of pride and unity. Figures like Joan of Arc became enduring symbols of resistance and resilience, embodying the spirit of a nation that had overcome immense adversity. As the dust settled, the Hundred Years' War stood as a testament to the enduring complexities of medieval politics and the transformative power of conflict. It was a war that reshaped nations, redefined the nature of power, and ushered in a new era in European history. While the battles may have ended, the echoes of the Hundred Years' War continued to reverberate, influencing the political, social, and cultural landscapes of Europe for generations.